Grease, stale coffee, and the metallic tang of rain. That was the smell of bad decisions. Simone should have locked the diner door at midnight. Instead, she flipped the sign, letting in a shivering, hollow-eyed kid. She didn't know he belonged to the deadliest man in the city. The pumice stone scraped across the flat-top griddle with a sound like grinding teeth. Simone leaned her weight into it, her shoulders aching with a dull, familiar fire. At 2 a.m, the diner didn't just look sad. It felt infected. The air was thick with the ghost of 1,000 burnt onions and the sharp chemical bite of cheap bleach. Outside, the rain was coming down in sheets, drumming a relentless, punishing rhythm against the cracked glass of the storefront. Simone paused, dragging the back of a greasy forearm across her forehead. She was 29, but under the flickering, asthmatic hum of the fluorescent tubes, she felt 50. Her dark skin, usually vibrant, looked washed out, coated in a fine sheen of fryer oil and exhaustion. She tossed the pumice stone into a metal bucket. Clang. The sound echoed in the empty room. She wanted to go home. She wanted to sink into her cheap mattress, pull the covers over her braids, and pretend the bank wasn't going to call at 8 a.m. about her overdue business loan. Then a shadow detached itself from the street lamp outside. Simone froze, a rag half raised to the counter. She watched the silhouette press against the glass. It was small. Too small to be a drunk. Too small to be a mugger. She walked over, her rubber-soled shoes squeaking against the linoleum. Through the rain-streaked window, a pair of dark, flat eyes stared back at her. It was a boy. He looked no older than 8. Simone groaned, a harsh sound in the back of her throat. "No, I'm not doing this today. We're closed." She pointed to the neon sign that she had already killed, mouthing the word closed with exaggerated lip movements. The boy didn't blink. He didn't plead. He just stood there, letting the freezing rain plaster his dark hair to his forehead. He was wearing a trench coat that looked absurdly expensive, thick, tailored wool, but it was drenched, dragging in the filthy sidewalk puddles. Simone turned her back. "Mind your business," her brain supplied, sounding exactly like her late Uncle Ray, who had left her this failing diner and its mounting debts. "You let one stray in. You feed the whole neighborhood." She walked back to the register. She started counting the pitiful stack of 1s and 5s. $10, 20, 23. Thunder rattled the windows. The diner shuddered. Simone slammed the cash drawer shut, a string of curses spilling from her mouth. She didn't let him in because she was a hero. She let him in because the weight of his stare was making her nausea worse, and because she was simply too tired to live with the guilt of reading about a frozen kid in the morning paper. She marched to the door, threw the deadbolt, and yanked it open. The wind immediately whipped a spray of cold water into her face. "Get in," she snapped. "Before I change my mind." The boy stepped over the threshold silently. He didn't shake off the water like a wet dog. He didn't thank her. He just stood on the checkered mat, dripping. Up close, the contradictions in his appearance were jarring. The wool coat was tailored. Beneath it, a silk shirt clung to his bony frame. But his knuckles were bruised, split open, and crusted with dark, dried blood. Mud caked his leather loafers. "You got a name?" Simone asked, locking the door behind him. "Nothing." "You speak English?" He looked at her, his expression utterly blank. Then, his eyes drifted over her shoulder, locking onto the rotating pie case. "Right. Hungry." Simone sighed. She pointed to a red vinyl stool at the counter. Sit down. Don't bleed on the formica. She didn't cook him anything fresh. The flat top was already clean, and she wasn't dirtying it again for charity. She went to the fridge and pulled out a ceramic bowl of leftover beef stew, shoving it into the microwave. She slammed the door and hit 2 minutes. The machine hummed, a low vibration that did nothing to fill the heavy silence in the room. Simone leaned against the counter, studying him. He sat perfectly still, his posture rigid. As he rested his hands on his lap, the sleeve of his oversized coat pulled back. Gold flashed under the kitchen light. Simone squinted. It was a watch, not a cheap digital thing. A heavy, complex piece of Swiss machinery that probably cost more than her entire diner. Who the hell is this kid? The microwave beeped. Simone grabbed a rag, pulled the hot bowl out, and dropped it in front of him along with a tarnished spoon. Eat. The boy looked at the stew, the thick brown gravy, the chunks of tough beef, the overcooked carrots. For a second, Simone thought he was going to turn up his nose at it. Instead, he grabbed the spoon in a tight fist and began to shovel the food into his mouth. He ate with a terrifying, mechanical ferocity. Gravy splattered onto his chin, dripping down to his collar. Simone watched him, a slow knot tightening in her stomach. That wasn't just dirt on his collar. It was blood. And judging by the amount of it, it wasn't his. She reached under the counter, her fingers brushing the cold plastic of her cell phone. She should call the police. It was the right thing to do. But calling the cops in this neighborhood meant hours of questioning. It meant forms, suspicion, and probably a squad car parked outside her diner, scaring off the few paying customers she had left. Slow down, she muttered, sliding a glass of tap water toward him. You're going to make yourself sick. He didn't slow down. He scraped the bottom of the bowl, the metal spoon screeching against the ceramic. When he was finished, he set the spoon down carefully, perfectly parallel to the bowl. He picked up a cheap paper napkin and wiped his mouth. You want more? Simone asked, her voice softer this time. The boy looked at her. For the first time, she saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Not gratitude, just a cold, calculating assessment. He gave a single, sharp nod. Simone turned to go back to the fridge. She never made it. It started as a vibration, a deep sub-bass rumble that rattled the coffee mugs on their hooks and traveled up through the soles of Simone's shoes. She stopped, her hand lingering on the refrigerator handle. The sound of the rain was suddenly drowned out by the roar of heavy engines. Headlights, blindingly bright, high-end LEDs, slashed through the horizontal blinds, painting sharp white stripes across the dark diner. Simone turned her head. Through the gaps in the blinds, she saw them. 3 massive jet-black SUVs. They didn't park in the designated spots. They rolled right up onto the curb, forming a steel barricade around the entrance. Her breath caught in her throat. The air in the diner suddenly felt incredibly thin. She looked at the boy. He hadn't moved. He was still staring straight ahead, but his posture had gone completely rigid. The air of the lost, hungry stray vanished. He looked like a soldier bracing for an impact. Hey, Simone whispered, her voice trembling. Hey, kid. You know them? The heavy thud of car doors slamming shut answered her. 4 men stepped out into the rain. They didn't rush. They didn't huddle against the cold. They wore immaculate dark suits, their broad shoulders moving with a synchronized, predatory grace. They fanned out, 2 flanking the door, 2 stepping inside. The little brass bell above the door chimed, a cheerful, pathetic little sound that made Simone want to throw up. The two men stepped into the diner. They were built like brick walls, their eyes scanning the room, dismissing Simone instantly. They parted, creating a path. Then he walked in. Simone felt her pulse thump a heavy, irregular rhythm against her ribs. The man who entered didn't just walk into the room. He absorbed all the oxygen in it. He was Korean, tall, with cheekbones sharp enough to cut glass and hair styled back with careless precision. He wore a charcoal three-piece suit that looked completely dry despite the storm outside. He carried the scent of ozone, high-end cedarwood cologne, and something distinctly metallic, like copper, like blood. This was Henry. He didn't wear a name tag, and Simone didn't know his name, but she knew what he was. You didn't grow up in this city without learning to recognize the apex predators. Henry stopped 3 feet from the counter, his dark eyes, devoid of any light or warmth, locked onto the boy. "Leo," Henry said. His voice was quiet, smooth. It had a faint accent, but the English was flawless. It wasn't a question. It was a command disguised as a name. The boy, Leo, slid off the vinyl stool. He stood straight, hands at his sides. He didn't look terrified, just profoundly resigned. Simone stood frozen behind the counter. Her hands gripped the edge of the formica so hard her knuckles ached. The sensible part of her brain was screaming to get down, to crawl under the sink and hide behind the industrial dishwasher. But her legs refused to work. She was trapped in the gravity of the room. Henry slowly turned his head. His gaze slid from his son and finally settled on Simone. When his eyes met hers, an involuntary shiver, violent enough to rattle her teeth, tore through her spine. His look was completely dehumanizing. He wasn't looking at a person. He was looking at an obstacle, a variable. "You," Henry said softly. Simone opened her mouth. Her throat was bone dry. She swallowed hard, forcing moisture into her mouth. "We're closed," she croaked. It was the stupidest thing she could have possibly said. One of the bodyguards shifted, his hand resting casually over his suit jacket near his ribs. A clear threat. Henry raised a single gloved finger. The bodyguard froze. "He was hungry," Henry stated, glancing down at the scraped-clean bowl of stew. "And you fed him. He was standing in the rain," Simone managed to say, her voice gaining a fraction of an ounce of strength. "I didn't know who he was. I just gave him leftovers." She was babbling, defending herself against an accusation that hadn't been made. She needed him to know she hadn't pried, hadn't asked questions, hadn't seen the blood on the kid's collar. Henry took a slow step forward. His leather shoes made absolutely no sound on the wet linoleum. He reached into his breast pocket. Simone flinched, instinctively throwing her arm up to cover her face. She expected the cold steel of a suppressed pistol. She expected the end of her life. Instead, Henry pulled out a silver money clip. It was thick with $100 bills, fresh, crisp, uncirculated currency. He peeled off 5 bills with his thumb. $500. He placed them flat on the sticky, grease-stained counter. "For the stew," Henry said. His tone was perfectly flat. Simone stared at the money. It was more than she made in 3 days. Her pride, buried somewhere deep beneath years of unpaid bills and exhaustion, screamed at her to push it back. To tell him she didn't want his dirty money. To tell him to get his kid and get out. She didn't do any of that. She stared at the green ink, feeling the hot flush of shame creep up her neck. She hated herself. She hated that she was calculating how many late fees this would cover. Henry watched her internal struggle. A faint, almost imperceptible smirk touched the corner of his mouth. He understood perfectly. He recognized a survivor's compromise when he saw it. "Come, Leo," Henry said, turning his back on Simone entirely. The boy didn't look back. He fell into step behind his father, his muddy loafers dragging against the floor. The two bodyguards backed out of the door, their eyes locked on Simone until the very last second. The bell chimed again. The heavy door clicked shut. Outside, the engines revved, drowning out the thunder. The headlights swept away, plunging the diner back into its dim, fluorescent gloom. Simone stood perfectly still for a long time. The only sound was the hiss of the rain and the erratic, frantic beating of her own heart. Slowly, her hand crept forward. Her fingers brushed the crisp edge of the $100 bills. They felt unnatural against the sticky counter. She snatched them up, shoving them deep into the pocket of her stained apron. Her hands were shaking violently now, a delayed reaction to the adrenaline draining from her blood. She grabbed her wet rag and started wiping the counter where the money had been, scrubbing furiously at an invisible stain. Scrubbing until her knuckles bled, trying to wash away the feeling that by taking that money, she had just invited a monster into her life. The $500 tasted like ash. Simone spent it in less than 48 hours. $200 to the electric company to stop the shutoff notice. $150 to the meat supplier who had threatened to cut off her credit. The rest went to a plumber to fix the grease trap that had been backing up into the alley, smelling of rotten cabbage and despair. Every time she looked at the newly welded pipe under the sink, her stomach turned. It was blood money. It bought her a few more weeks of drowning slowly instead of drowning today. 3 weeks passed. The paranoia began to recede, leaving behind the familiar dull ache of poverty. Simone stopped jumping every time headlights swept past the front windows. She convinced herself that the night of the storm was a bizarre hallucination, a collision of two worlds that would never touch again. She was wrong. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the dead hour, 3:15 p.m. The diner was empty, bathed in the sickly yellow glow of the afternoon sun fighting through unwashed window panes. Simone was scraping dried ketchup off the nozzle of a plastic bottle when the bell chimed. She didn't look up immediately. "Sit anywhere," she called out, her voice raspy from disuse. The back booth. The voice was smooth, quiet, and carried a weight that made the hair on Simone's arms stand up. She snapped her head up. Henry stood in the doorway. He wasn't flanked by a small army this time. He was alone with the boy, Leo. Henry wore a navy suit today, tailored so sharply it looked like armor. He looked entirely out of place, an apex predator standing in a cage meant for pigeons. Leo was wearing a pristine private school uniform, charcoal slacks, a blazer with a crest, and a striped tie. Simone's hand tightened around the ketchup bottle until the cheap plastic buckled. Her heart started that familiar, frantic hammering. "Tell him to leave. Tell him you'll call the cops." Simone swallowed, her throat suddenly parched. "I told you, we're closed." "The sign says open," Henry pointed out mildly. He didn't wait for her permission. He placed a hand on Leo's shoulder, guiding the boy past the counter toward the back booth. The one furthest from the windows. The one with a clear sight line of both the front door and the kitchen. Simone stayed rooted behind the counter. She watched them slide into the red vinyl seats. The vinyl shrieked in protest. Henry folded his hands on the scuffed formica table. He looked at her. He didn't demand service. He didn't say a word. He just waited. Simone hated him. She hated the sheer arrogance of his silence, the absolute certainty that the world would bend to his gravity. But more than that, she hated herself as her feet betrayed her, carrying her toward the coffee station. She grabbed 2 thick ceramic mugs and the glass carafe, her hands shaking so badly the brown liquid sloshed against the rim. She walked over to the booth. The smell of his cologne hit her again, expensive cedar wood masking something cold and metallic. She set the mugs down with a harsh clatter. "We don't serve kids espresso," she snapped, her voice trembling but hard. "Hot chocolate," Henry said. He didn't look at the menu. "And black coffee for me." "It's burned," she warned him. "Been sitting on the burner since noon." Henry held her gaze. Black coffee. Simone poured it. The dark liquid steamed in the mug, smelling bitter and exhausted. She turned on her heel, marching to the kitchen to whisk some powdered cocoa into hot milk for the boy. When she returned, Leo was tracing the deep scratches in the table with his index finger. He looked up at her as she set the steaming mug in front of him. His eyes were still blank, guarded, but the bruised knuckles from weeks ago were gone. For the next hour they sat there. Henry drank the terrible, acidic coffee without a single wince. He didn't check his phone. He didn't read a newspaper. He just watched the door. Leo drank his hot chocolate, perfectly silent. When they finally stood up to leave, Henry dropped $100 bill on the table. "Stop," Simone blurted out. The word tore out of her throat before she could filter it. Henry paused, turning his head slightly. "I don't want your money," Simone said, her chest heaving. "A coffee and cocoa is $4. I'm not a charity, and I'm not. Whatever this is, stop leaving hundreds." Henry looked at the crumpled bill on the table, then back to Simone. "It is not charity. It is a premium." "For what?" "For the booth in the back," Henry said quietly. "And for your silence." He walked out, the bell chiming a cheerful goodbye. Simone stared at the green bill on the table. The diner felt colder, the air thinner. He wasn't paying for food. He was paying for a safe house. And by leaving the money on the table, he was telling her she had already accepted the job. By the 4th week, it became a terrifying routine. Every Tuesday and Thursday, at exactly 3:15, the black SUV would idle at the curb. Henry and Leo would sit in the back booth. Henry drank the burnt coffee. Leo drank the powdered cocoa. Simone learned to keep her mouth shut and stay out of the crossfire of their heavy, suffocating silence. Then came the Friday. The routine broke. It was raining again, a miserable, freezing drizzle that slickened the sidewalks. The bell chimed violently, the door slamming against the wall. Simone flinched, dropping a handful of silverware into the plastic sorting bin. It wasn't Henry. It was Leo. He was alone. His school uniform was soaked, his breathing ragged. He didn't walk to the back booth. He scrambled behind the counter, ducking under the flap and pressing his back against the stainless steel prep station. He pulled his knees to his chest, his eyes wide and feral. Simone froze, a fork still clenched in her fist. "Hey," she hissed, looking toward the door. "What are you doing? Where's your—" Tires squealed outside. Rubber burned against wet asphalt. The sound of a heavy collision rattled the front windows. Simone's breath caught. She peered over the coffee machines. A battered silver sedan had slammed into a parked car out front. 2 men piled out. They weren't wearing tailored suits. They wore cheap leather jackets. They looked jagged, erratic, moving with a desperate, twitchy energy. One of them racked the slide of a pistol, tucking it flush against his thigh. They were heading for the door. "Oh, God," Simone whispered. The fork slipped from her numb fingers, clattering onto the floor. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded her veins. She looked down at Leo. He was staring at the swinging kitchen doors, his jaw clenched so hard his cheek twitched. "Stay under the counter," she breathed. "Do not make a sound." The bell chimed. The two men stepped inside. The smell of wet dog, stale cigarette smoke, and nervous sweat instantly overpowered the scent of old grease. "Where is he?" the first man barked. He had a jagged scar cutting through his left eyebrow. His eyes darted around the empty diner, lingering on the shadows of the booths. Simone wiped her hands on her apron. Her palms were slick with sweat. Her knees felt like they were made of water, but she forced herself to stand tall. "We're closed." The lie tasted like chalk. "Shut up," the second man snarled. He stepped up to the counter, invading her space. He smelled like cheap peppermint gum masking liquor. "We saw the kid run in here. Where is he?" "I don't know what you're talking about," Simone said. Her voice cracked. She hated how weak she sounded. She wasn't a gangster. She was a tired woman, buried in debt. "There's no kid here. You need to leave before I hit the panic button under the register." There was no panic button. The first man laughed, a harsh, scraping sound. He raised his hand. The metal of the gun caught the fluorescent light. He didn't point it at her. He just let it rest on the counter. A promise. "Lady, don't die for Henry's brat," he sneered. "We're taking him. You can breathe, or you can bleed on this dirty floor. Your call." The second man didn't wait. He started moving toward the opening in the counter, stepping closer to where Leo was hiding. Simone didn't think. There was no grand strategy, no heroic calculation. It was pure, blind, animal panic. Her hand shot out, grabbing the handle of the commercial coffee carafe resting on the warming plate. The plate had been on for 4 hours. The coffee inside was practically boiling tar. As the second man stepped through the counter flap, Simone swung the carafe. She aimed for his face. The heavy glass smashed against his jaw with a sickening crunch. The carafe shattered, sending a jagged spray of glass and scalding black liquid directly into his eyes and down his throat. The man let out a sound Simone would hear in her nightmares for the rest of her life, a high-pitched, wet, gargling shriek. He clawed at his face, his skin instantly blistering angry red. He stumbled backward, blindly colliding with the spinning pie case. The glass cracked, dropping the heavy metal shelves onto the floor with a catastrophic crash. The first man jolted, raising his gun, his face twisting in shock. "You crazy beat—" He never finished the sentence. The front glass of the diner exploded inward. A heavy, suppressed gunshot, puffed, whipped through the air. The man with the scar froze. A neat, dark hole appeared between his eyes. The back of his head blew out, painting the frosted glass of the front door in a horrific spray of crimson and gray. He dropped like a marionette with cut strings, his body hitting the linoleum with a heavy, lifeless thud. Simone backed away, her hands pressed over her ears, her chest heaving violently. She hit the edge of the sink and slid down to the floor, her apron soaked in spilled coffee and shaking uncontrollably. The burnt smell of the liquid mixed with the metallic, iron-rich stench of blood in the air. Through the shattered window, a black SUV sat idling in the rain. The door opened. Henry stepped out, He walked through the destroyed entrance, his expensive shoes crunching over the broken safety glass. He ignored the dead man on the floor. He ignored the screaming man rolling in the pie debris, who was quickly silenced by a swift, brutal kick to the temple from one of Henry's suited enforcers entering behind him. Henry walked behind the counter. He looked down. Simone was sitting in a puddle of coffee, her chest rising and falling in jagged gasps, her eyes locked on the carnage. Next to her, Leo was slowly uncurling from his defensive ball. The boy looked at the broken glass, the blood, and then up at his father. Henry reached out a gloved hand and pulled his son to his feet. He checked him for injuries with a quick clinical gaze. Satisfied the boy was unharmed, Henry's dark, hollow eyes shifted down to Simone. She expected him to shoot her. She had seen his face. She had seen his men kill. She was a liability. Instead, Henry crouched down. The sharp crease of his trousers barely brushed the dirty, wet floor. He reached into his jacket. Simone flinched, squeezing her eyes shut, waiting for the cold barrel of a gun. A hand grasped her shoulder. It wasn't rough. It was surprisingly gentle, grounding her erratic trembling. She opened her eyes. Henry was looking at her, and for the first time, there was a terrifying, profound respect in his gaze. He didn't hand her a wad of cash this time. He didn't treat her like a transaction. "You protected my blood," Henry whispered, his voice barely audible over the rain. I just wanted them out," Simone stammered, choking back a sob. I didn't want to." "It does not matter what you wanted," Henry said slowly, his grip tightening just enough to make her look at him. "It matters what you did. You bleed for mine. Now my family bleeds for you." He stood up, towering over her in the wreckage of her life. Simone stared at him, the horrifying truth sinking into her bones. She hadn't saved her diner today. She had just sold her soul to the devil, and the devil had decided to move in. "Clean this up," Henry instructed his men without looking back. He rested his hand on Leo's head. "We will see you on Tuesday, Simone. If you felt your heart pounding during that intense showdown, smash that like button right now." Simone just made the ultimate sacrifice to protect a mafia boss's son, and there is no turning back. What would you have done in her shoes? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe and share this video with your friends so you don't miss the epic continuation of Simone and Henry's twisted story.